Hi, my name is Donald Manconi. I am the Director of Track Train Dynamics at CP Rail. Today I'm at the Locomotive Engineer Training Center at Montreal. One of our responsibilities is to provide informative guidelines for operating and maintenance personnel. The film you are about to see today has been produced by the Union Pacific Railroad and is an excellent description of the air brake system on a freight car. It will describe how closing an angle cock under certain circumstances can cause an undesired brake release and permit cars to run away. I'll be back later, but right now, let's see how closing an angle cock is bottling the air.
Stop next to Whitco, Cal.
Okay, stop across from Whitco it is.
Brakeman Smith to UP 3130. That'll be good when you get them stopped. Over. UP 3130. Okay, that's good. UP 3130, take them ahead to the west end of the siding. Over. Dispatcher, this is 3130. We've got a runaway cut of cars moving eastbound out of Art, heading towards Las Vegas.
What went wrong? How can leaving a cut of cars with the angle cocks closed at both ends of the brake pipe result in such a disaster? To understand why bottling the air creates such a dangerous situation, it will be necessary to acquire a working knowledge of the air brake system. Every freight car is equipped with 5 basic air brake components: the brake pipe, control valve, auxiliary reservoir, the emergency reservoir, and the brake cylinder with related rods, levers, rigging, and brake shoes. Let's explore the basic function of these components. The brake pipe may be considered the signal relayer. It is a continuous air line consisting of pipe and flexible hose. The brake pipe extends from the front of the train through each car to the rear of the train. It is closed at both ends during normal train operation to allow pressurization. Brake pipe pressure is controlled through the operation of the automatic brake valve on the locomotive, except for some minor leakage in the system. The auxiliary reservoir is a storage tank charged from the brake pipe. This stored air pressure is delivered to the brake cylinder during service brake applications. The emergency reservoir is also a storage tank charged by the brake pipe. Air pressure from this reservoir is used primarily for emergency brake applications. A small portion of this air is also used during service releases to help recharge the system. The control valve consists of an emergency and service portion and is the signal receiver, the brain of the freight car. The control valve receives and interprets changes in brake pipe pressure and responds to apply or release brakes according to these pressure fluctuations. The brake cylinder, when pressurized, provides movement through a piston and a series of rods and levers to force the brake shoes against the wheel. This pressure provides the major retarding force necessary to slow or stop a train. The basic components are interconnected to one another through the control valve by piping. To better understand the control valve functions in applying or releasing brakes, let's look at some basic principles or laws of physics. Pascal's principle states pressure is the same in all directly connected parts of a system. Applying this principle to air brakes means pressurized air is exerting an equal force on all areas of a container in which it is held. Also, if reservoirs or pipes are connected to different air pressure storage tanks, the high pressure will flow to the lower pressure until the pressures equalize. This principle of equalization is very important in understanding the basic operation of air brakes. The physicist Charles looks at pressure a little differently. Charles' law states the force exerted on an object is a function of the pressure applied and the area of the object. Let us look at a piston. What happens when the air pressure on one side is greater than the pressure on the opposite side? The higher pressure forces the piston to move toward the lower pressure side. This simplified model of the air brake system will be used to develop a basic understanding of air brakes. To begin, the brake pipe must be pressurized. This process is called charging the train. After the locomotives are added to the train, all angle cocks are opened except the angle cocks on the front of the lead unit and the rear of the last car of the train. Pressurized air stored on the locomotive moves through the brake valve into the unpressurized brake pipe. Given enough time, the entire brake pipe will attempt to charge to the pressure that is applied at the head end, Pascal's principle. The normal charging process may take up to 1 hour for a 115-car train. Union Pacific standards require brake pipe pressure to be set at 80 or 90 pounds per square inch. Trains east of North Platte are set at 80 pounds, while trains west of North Platte are set at 90 pounds. As the brake pipe air pressure increases during this charging process, the auxiliary and emergency reservoirs on each car are also charged. Let's examine the freight car control valve operation, concentrating only on the auxiliary reservoir. By dissecting the control valve, examination of the internal parts can be made. The major component in the control valve is the service piston and related slide valve. The movement of this piston and slide valve determines if the brakes apply or release. The slide valve moves by applying air pressure to the service piston. Look what happens as the train is being charged. Since there is no air pressure in the auxiliary reservoir or the brake cylinder, the brakes are released. At each car, air diverts down the branch pipe. When the air pressure is sufficient to overcome friction of the moving parts, 1.5 pounds pressure is necessary. The piston and slide valve are forced to move. Notice when the piston moves, a port is uncovered, allowing brake pipe air to flow through a charging choke. Pascal's principle tells us that air will also flow into the auxiliary reservoir. Pressure will continue to build in the reservoir and on the back of the piston until equalized with the brake pipe. Once equalization is reached, the system is charged. The slide valve will remain stationary until there is sufficient air pressure change on either side of the piston to cause movement. To apply the train brakes, the engineer moves the automatic brake valve handle into the service zone. This allows brake pipe air to vent to atmosphere at a controlled rate. As a result, pressure throughout the brake pipe decreases, which also decreases the pressure on the left side of the service piston. When the pressure on the left side of the piston is 1.5 pounds lower than the right side, the higher pressure on the right side will cause the piston and slide valve to move from right to left. Remember, this is what Charles' law explained earlier. Watch as communication between the auxiliary reservoir and the brake cylinder is established. Air will flow from the higher pressure auxiliary reservoir into the zero pressure brake cylinder, forcing the piston to overcome spring tension and move outward. As the piston moves, the rods and levers force the brake shoe against the wheel. This ultimately provides the retarding force necessary to slow or stop the train. The movement of air from the auxiliary reservoir into the brake cylinder will continue until the pressure on the right side of the piston becomes slightly less than the left side. The greater pressure on the left side of the piston forces it to move to the right, terminating the connection between the auxiliary reservoir and the brake cylinder. This is called the lap position. While in the lap position, the auxiliary reservoir isn't permitted to charge any further. Established brake cylinder pressure will remain constant if there are no leaks in the brake cylinder or associated piping. When the engineer decides it's time to release the brakes, he moves the automatic brake handle to the release position. This allows air to flow from the main reservoirs on the locomotive into the brake pipe, increasing the pressure in the brake pipe. Looking once more at the control valve operation, as brake pipe pressure increases throughout the train, pressure is also building on the left side of the piston. Once the pressure on the left side of the piston becomes 1.5 pounds greater than the right side, the piston moves. This movement of piston and slide valve accomplishes two things. First, a port in the slide valve allows air trapped in the brake cylinder to escape to atmosphere and release the brakes. Secondly, brake pipe air is allowed to flow through the charging choke to the right of the service piston. This air is used to replenish air in the auxiliary reservoir that was used during the previous brake application. The brakes are now released, the system recharged, and a complete application and release cycle of the brakes has been observed. Up to this point, this study has been confined to service brake applications. This involves the service portion of the control valve, the auxiliary reservoir, and the brake cylinder. Although this program has not concentrated on the emergency reservoir, it should be understood the emergency reservoir and auxiliary reservoir are charged simultaneously with air from the brake pipe. The emergency reservoir is also used to help release the brakes and recharge the brake system during a typical service release. Although this action, known as accelerated service release, improves release and recharge time, this action can also help trigger an undesired release of the brakes. Now we understand the basic operation of train air brakes. Let's see what happened to Cal's train and try to determine what caused it to roll away. Cal used a 20-pound reduction to bring the train to a stop. This reduction should cause all operating brakes in the train to apply. Air brake rules require at least a 20-pound reduction prior to leaving a cut of cars. Next, the trainman closed the angle cock on the portion of the train to be moved. The angle cock was also closed on the portion of the train the crew intended to leave behind. Leaving a cut of cars with angle cocks closed at both ends of the brake pipe is a serious violation of the air brake rules. Let's examine why bottling the air is prohibited. Begin by looking at the brake pipe pressure. Assume Cal's train has 115 cars with 3 pounds of leakage. Completely charged, the train would have 90 pounds at the head end, and because of the train length and leakage, approximately 88 pounds at the rear. This 2-pound differential is referred to as a normal gradient. Normal gradient is a term used to express the difference between the brake pipe pressure on the front end and rear end of the train. The gradient is dependent upon brake pipe leakage and the length of the brake pipe. As brake pipe leakage and train length increase, the normal gradient also increases. Other more temporary gradients that can have an effect on air brake operations are inverse gradients and false gradients. An inverse gradient is created during the process of setting the brakes. A false gradient is created any time the train brakes are set and released. Remember, Cal's train had 90 pounds at the head end and 88 pounds per square inch at the rear end under normal conditions. To set the brakes, Cal moves the automatic brake handle into the service zone, making a 20-pound reduction. The moment the automatic brake valve handle enters the service zone, brake pipe air begins to exhaust to atmosphere at the automatic brake valve. The escaping air at the head end creates a temporary condition with lower pressure at the front of the train than the rear. When the brake pipe pressure at the head end reaches 70 pounds, the rear brake pipe pressure would be 80 pounds. This 10-pound inverse gradient will revert to a normal gradient when the air stops exhausting at the head end and the pressure is equalized. After the brake pipe equalizes, the normal gradient will be reestablished. To release the brakes, Cal moves the automatic brake valve to the release position. The brake pipe begins to charge from the front of the train toward the rear. The supply pressure is greater at the head end, resulting in the first car charging much more rapidly than the last car. In fact, when the first car is completely charged to 90 pounds, the rear car is still at 81 pounds. The resulting 9-pound false gradient will diminish as the rear of the train charges to the maximum of 88 pounds. A false gradient can be magnified significantly by applying and releasing the brakes in rapid succession and not allowing the brake pipe to recharge completely between sets and releases. Some important points to remember about gradients are: normal gradients are established as a result of brake pipe pressure, brake pipe leakage, and train length. Once a train is put together, the train length, brake pipe pressure, and leakage are relatively constant. Therefore, the normal gradient for a particular train remains the same. False and inverse gradients are created during normal applications and release of the train brakes. Both false and inverse gradients will revert to a normal gradient through the process of equalization. It may be helpful to think of a train as though each car is a water reservoir, all cars being connected with pipes. Now picture the lead car is filled with water and the rear car is only 1/4 full. This example simulates a false gradient. The higher water level at the front will equalize with the lower water level at the rear. For inverse gradients, the equalization process would be reversed. Higher water level at the rear will equalize with the lower water level at the front. Now we can examine how gradients affect air brake operation. As false gradients are more likely to create problems, we will address them first. Prior to stopping, Cal has set and released the brakes a sufficient number of times to create a false gradient. Upon stopping, Cal uses a 20-pound brake pipe reduction. Following the rules, Cal listens for the air to stop exhausting at the automatic brake valve and gives a signal to the trainman to close the angle cock. With a false gradient established in the brake pipe, the trainman closes both angle cocks, therefore bottling the air in the cut of cars they intended to leave behind. Remembering Pascal's principle, the higher pressure at the front of the train is going to equalize with the lower pressure at the rear of the train. This equalization process will cause the rear end pressure to rise. During this equalization, look what happened to the control valves at the rear end of the cut of cars. After closing the angle cock, the service piston and slide valve would be in the lap position. As the brake pipe pressure levels off, higher pressure at the front of the train flows back toward the rear, causing pressure at the rear end to increase. When the brake pipe pressure exceeds the auxiliary reservoir by 1.5 pounds, the piston and slide valve move to the release position. Air trapped in the brake cylinder is allowed to exhaust to the atmosphere, causing an unintentional release of the brakes. During this process, the emergency reservoir has remained charged to the original brake pipe pressure. Simultaneously with the brake cylinder release, accelerated service release activity is started. A portion of the air stored in the emergency reservoir is dumped into the air brake system to help speed up the release and recharge the brake system. In this case, the unintentional release is magnified as each emergency reservoir dumps to help recharge the system. An inverse gradient is equally dangerous in creating the possibility of an unintentional release of brakes. Air escaping at the automatic brake valve creates a temporary situation where the pressure at the front of the train is lower than the rear. As the higher rear end pressure equalizes, the head end pressure rises. This rise can be of sufficient level to start a release of the brakes. Once the release is established, accelerated service release activity causes a chain reaction to release all brakes in the cars left standing. Another condition that may cause an unwanted release of the brakes is the closing of angle cocks before the air has stopped exhausting at the automatic brake valve. Referring to our model, remember that the air movement is toward the front of the train during service brake pipe reduction. When an angle cock is closed against this moving air, a damming effect is created. The moving air is suddenly stopped by the closed angle cock and forms an air wave which is transmitted back toward the rear of the train. This wave can be of sufficient amplitude to initiate an unintentional release of the brakes. 1.5 pound differential across the service piston will cause the piston to move, resulting in a brake release. Once the release is started, accelerated service release action can provide enough additional air pressure in the brake pipe to release an entire train. There remains one more important factor when discussing the problems with bottling the air. All modern freight cars have a release rod attached to the service portion of the control valve. The release rod provides a way to release the brakes on a car and/or drain the auxiliary and emergency reservoirs. So why is this important if the air is bottled? Let's examine once again our simplified version of the control valve. The release rod works by allowing some of the air trapped in the auxiliary reservoir to escape to atmosphere. This has the same effect on the service piston as raising the brake pipe pressure. The result is higher pressure on the left side of the piston, causing it to move to the release position. Once the release is initiated on one car, accelerated service release activity takes place, dumping a portion of the air trapped in the emergency reservoir back into the system. The increase in brake pipe pressure can be significant enough to cause the next car to release, and so on, creating a chain reaction and releasing all brakes on a cut of cars. How then do we prevent an unintentional release of the brakes and the catastrophic results of these releases? Simply by leaving an angle cock open at the end of a cut of cars to be left standing. With the brake pipe being open to atmosphere, there is no possibility of the brake pipe pressure increasing to a level which would result in a release of the brakes.
At CP Rail, the air brake and train handling rules and instructions are outlined in Form 584. Rule 14A states that to separate and leave standing a portion of a train with the brakes applied, the angle cock on the locomotive or on the portion to be moved must be closed only after it is known that the service brake application has been made and the service exhaust has stopped at the automatic brake valve. The service brake application must be sufficient to prevent train movement while the brake pipe hoses are parted. The standing portion must be left in emergency with the angle cock open. Precautions against unintended movement must be taken. When directed by bulletin or special instructions, 14A may be amended as follows. The standing portion must be left with the angle cock open. This opening to be done slowly to avoid an emergency application. This presentation has explained the dangers of bottling the air. Please remember always, when leaving cars standing, the angle cock must be left open.